what I'd like to do now is turn the program over to our speaker, Dr. Dan Fulgham. He told me that I needed to keep his introduction very brief, and so I will do that. Because really, you know, if you take out the educational stuff and the 200 combat missions and the spacesuit testing and the high-altitude balloon jumps and the 3 or 4 careers in science and management and development and discovery, there's very little to talk about. So I won't belabor that too much more, but I'm really looking forward to his talk tonight because this is a piece of living history. You know, Herodotus, when he began to write history in 450 BC, was writing about the Greco-Persian wars that were occurring. And history turned out to be an instant success with the population because Herodotus spiced up the history with personal anecdotes and information about the people who were living in the area and the plants and the animals that were present. And so it turned out to be more than just a little bit of history. But one of the knocks on Herodotus was that he wrote things that weren't perhaps quite accurate. And his apology for that was that he was just writing down what people told him. And of course, the key to historical accurateness is to have a first-person account. And so we're fortunate tonight to have someone who can give us a first-person account of what happened to the USS Pueblo. Dr. Fulgham.
Thank you, sir. All right. Why the Pueblo? The Pueblo was a research ship that was captured by the North Koreans in 1968 and held a crew for 11 months. And we finally recovered that group. And a lot of questions came out of that. Why did this happen to begin with? And you can't forecast what the Koreans are going to do, I can guarantee you. But why was no help offered? Why did they not have some intercession with aircraft or Navy ships or whatever to try and recover the ship and the crew before it ever got into foreign hands? And that's what I'm going to speak to tonight, because there's a lot of luck involved in this story. There's a lot of fate involved in the story, and I think you'll find that part of it quite interesting as we go along. And we'll have hopefully time for questions afterwards. And if I start running over my time, my wife is supposed to throw something at me. So here's the incident that I'll be speaking about. It all happened on January the 23rd, 1968. Pueblo was captured on the high seas in international waters by the North Koreans. The crew was released 11 months later. And so what happened before, between, and after, and how did I get involved? I don't talk about anything in the way of history that I did not have a personal interaction with. So everything I tell you is going to be things that I saw or investigated or what happened. These are the special orders that sent me and another officer to the Far East for a period of 10 weeks to investigate the Air Force's part in the loss of the Pueblo itself. So if it comes to, how many people in here were in the Navy at one time or other? Well, there goes part of my story right there. But I'll try and keep the terminology pretty common. Here's what the U.S. Pueblo was, and I can tell you it was just an Army freighter that was really designed and built to be used in the Great Lakes. So it was a fairly small ship. And here's a picture of it, and about the only picture that I have. It's 177 feet long, and it's 32 feet wide at the beam. It drew about 9 feet of water. And this was modified in Bremerton, Washington, and a large part of the the structure on the top of the ship is the data collection. It was used for collecting electronic signals that were being sent out from people in North Korea. In this case, if they turned the radar on or they turned the radio on or anything was sent out over the air, the ship collected that data, recorded it, and put it into a classified file, and that's what the ship was for. So you'll be seeing this picture more often. I had some concern when I saw the water line down here. I said, wait a minute, that should have been up here. And somebody told me, yeah, the ship's backing up. It's at sea trials. So you can't believe what you see all the time. So here was the commander, and it's commander in the Navy is equivalent to a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force or the Army. But once you take command of a ship, you become a captain. So he was a submariner, Lloyd Bucher, and he took command of the ship in 1967, actually. They left Bremerton, Washington, went down the west coast of the United States to San Francisco and San Diego, and then on to Japan. In Tokyo Bay here was a naval station called Yokosuka, and that's where they put into port to refurbish and get a few new crew members and take on some supplies. And that was in early or late December of 1967. And then on January the 5th, they left Tokyo. It went around the end of Kyushu to Sasebo, which was another Navy base, and they took on their last provisions and dropped a couple of the crew off that weren't going to go with them, and got ready to set out for their duty station over North Korea. And one of the interesting things here, one of the crew members came back to the ship and he said, hey, I was just in a bar, and the bar girl, Japanese girl, came up and said, hey, sailor, where you go? He said, I don't know, ma'am. They haven't told me where I'm going to go. And she broke out laughing and said, ha, ha, sailor, I tell you where you go. You go to North Korea. So everybody over there knew what was going on anyway. Sasebo here, Nagasaki is right here, and Hiroshima is right there. So that sets it in the context of the World War II area. So January the 11th, they left Sasebo and started through the straits. They worked their way up so that they were off the shore of North Korea. And going through the straits, the weather got pretty bad, and it was in January, and very cold, and lots of ice was forming on the top of the ship. In fact, the ship got to the point that they were having to send crew members up with wooden mallets to break the ice off of the antennas and poles, because it got so top heavy that in the heavy waves, the ship was rolling as far as 35 degrees in each way. And if it got to 45 degrees, it was probably just going to go on over and sink. So they were quite concerned and worked pretty hard at getting rid of that ice. So they took up the station here about the 12th, and they were to be there for 2 weeks. And they cruised up and down over North Korea's shoreline here, picking up electronic signals. It was a spy ship, no question about it. It was a spy ship. And then they were taken prisoner here, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and the ship was brought into Wonsan Harbor in North Korea. So let's see what happened here. There's a rundown of the capture, and I'll talk a little bit more about that rather than have you read it. The big thing here, they made multiple calls for help and got no answers. They were in one of those areas up near the north where when the Aurora Borealis or that sort of activity takes in, it just wipes out your communications ability. They did finally get through, but they were a long time doing it. So what happened on the 22nd of January, 2 patrol ships came out from Korea and circled the boat, the ship, circled the ship about 300 yards out. No hostile maneuverings toward the ship itself. The Captain Bucher, just ignored them because he was in international waters, and he didn't think they posed any threat. But the very next day, and I'll back up into this a little bit, the very next day they reported, here comes 2 patrol boats again, but they were accompanied by 2 torpedo boats. And what makes this significant, torpedo boats can run at about 35 miles an hour. This ship, with a tailwind and everybody rowing as fast as they can and everything in the engine room working, they can probably do about 10 miles an hour. So once these torpedo boats started circling the ship, they got closer and closer, and they started demanding, stop, we're going to board you and take you into harbor. And Bucher just ignored that because he didn't think they were really meant it. But then they started firing on the ship. They were firing 50 caliber machine guns right into the ship itself, and he said, okay, I think they're serious. So he gave the order to get rid of the classified material. They had an incinerator on board, and it wouldn't burn the paper in this room in 2 weeks. So they started putting them in bags, weighted bags, throwing them overboard. And they would sink, but then that got too slow, so he just started throwing paper out in the water. And the torpedo boat says, they knew what they were doing. It said, stop that, or we're going to sink you. And they started firing again. And this is where they killed one of the crew members. He was up here and threw a bag overboard, and they shot him with a 50 caliber, hit him in the leg, severed the femoral artery, and he died before they could get him in. Well, Bucher decided that they're pretty serious now, so he stopped. They boarded the ship and towed it into Wonsan Harbor. So who could have helped? Who would have been there that could have done some good for them? The Navy 7th Fleet was in Yokohama, which is in Tokyo Bay. The U.S. Air Force had a command post at Fuchu, which is just outside of Tokyo and close to the same naval base at Yokohama. So here's Tokyo, and there's the Navy and the Air Force headquarters. No activity, no armed aircraft or anything of that nature. And so, let me just, the Navy had the Enterprise. The Enterprise is at Yokohama Harbor, and it's part of a task force. And it was on a mission then that they left Yokohama and headed out to sea as a member of task force and started south for Formosa. And so that ship was not going to be much help to them. What did the Air Force had? On Okinawa, they had the F-105s, and they had a whole, a whole wing of F-105s, could carry 6 750-pound bombs, lots of fuel, but they were 800 miles south of North Korea. They had F-4s here in South Korea, right there at Kunsan, where I was stationed for a while. And they were the closest to the ship. But what had happened on the 22nd, the North Koreans had sent an assassination group into South Korea dressed in South Korean military uniforms, and they attacked the Blue House where the South Korean president lived with the intention of assassinating him. They were not captured, but they were identified before they got within about 4 blocks of the house. And they were all killed except for one, and he quickly volunteered exactly what the mission was up to. But the problem was now, because of all of that excitement and the probability of if they were trying to assassinate the president, something else must have been underway. So these F-4s were armed with nuclear weapons and were sitting on strip alert right here at Kunsan. They couldn't be used. They wasn't any use for a nuclear weapon at all. So why didn't the Pueblo get help? Well, part of it was their fault. they delayed transmissions. They didn't focus early enough on getting rid of classified materials that had been shot at. The deck guns were completely encased in ice and couldn't be used. And the stage had already been set. A Navy admiral in Hawaii downgraded the Pueblo mission risk assessment to minimal from hazardous. And when they did that, there was no longer any need for any military unit to be standing alert. Just nobody paid any attention to the ship at all. And before he left Sasebo, Commander Bucher had pleaded with Hawaii, please return us to hazardous mission status. We think we're going to need to have that. They refused to do it. No explanation, just you go out there, there's no danger. The ship they were relieving was in a hazardous mission category. So now here's where fate came into play. The Navy command post in Yokohama started receiving help calls. We need help, but they didn't know where it was coming from. And the reason was that the signals were not being sent to a Navy outfit. They were going through the National Security Agency. So by the time it got to the command post says, who in the heck's a Pueblo? And they had to call Hawaii to find out what to do about it. And Hawaii said, yep, that's one of our ships, and get a hold of the Enterprise and see if they can get out there and help. Well, the Navy, in the meantime, also sent, well, let me go back here. Here's this ship steaming south. They're 700 miles away, and they're under communications blackout. That means that they're not to make any transmissions. They're not to respond to any transmissions. So it took a long time for Hawaii to convince them to unlock their blackout situation and get back in the loop again. In the meantime, at the Air Force Headquarters command post, and these are men 24 hours a day, the regular command post duty officer was on leave. And his replacement was a young Air Force captain, and I interviewed all of these people. Young Air Force captain, and when they got the code in from the Navy, it says, help, we need immediate assistance, we're being attacked. He didn't recognize the code word. He'd never seen it before. So he had to go to John. That's what the Air Force called the restroom, was John. Navy called it a head. And I never understood why we call it a restroom. I never went into a men's room and saw anybody resting. They're usually at a urinal or sitting on a pot. But anyway, he was walking down a hall, going to the pisser, and he passed a Navy liaison officer going the other way that was down from Yokohama. He said, hey, Pete, said, I just got a code word in that I don't understand, but it looks like it belongs to the Navy. Would you come take a look at it? The guy said, sure, as soon as you get back from the John, or the head, the Navy called it, we'll go look that up, which they did. And sure enough, it was an absolute immediate call for help. We need immediate assistance. So let's see, the Pueblo was captured at 2:30 in the afternoon. By the time all of this transpired, it's about 3:30. And over there, it gets dark at 5:30 in the wintertime. Battle staff was assembled. Major General McKee ordered immediate action. Let's do something about that ship. He says, you get down there and get 8 of those F-105s airborne immediately and see if you can get that ship before they get in the harbor. So, fate stepped in again. When it sent the word to Okinawa, the entire air wing, every airplane that could fly, was back in the traffic pattern, recovering from a max effort training exercise. And they had no gas, no guns, no bombs, nothing. They were in absolutely no shape to go anywhere. So by the time they could get fueled up, armed up, and get to one side, it would be well after dark. And the F-4s, as I said, were not a factor at all. So here we are, the ship's in a harbor here. We've got airplanes down here that can't be used. The Enterprise is 700 miles down here, and the F-105s are 800 miles away. So they're sitting there wondering where they can get some more help. So they arm the F-105s, and General McKee says, I want you over Wonsan Harbor at first light. That means 30 minutes before daylight. And I want that ship destroyed. And of course the question immediately came up, but what if the crew's still aboard? And McKee said, yeah, I repeat, I want that ship that's destroyed completely. It's still on the 23rd. So during the night, while they were waiting to get airborne to go, the State Department says, well, it's a little risky to alarm these people in the north. We don't want to get on their bad side. They might start a war again. Lyndon Johnson got involved at the White House and McNamara at the Pentagon. And the word came back right after midnight on the 23rd, stop all efforts to destroy the ship and rescue the crew. Lyndon Johnson said, we'll make our usual demands and see if we can get them released immediately. Okay, what could have possibly happened? Possibly he could have destroyed the ship on the 24th, but it wouldn't have made any difference because late in the morning on the 24th, they detected a cargo airplane taking off out of Wonsan and tracked it all the way to Moscow. So they had stripped all of the communications equipment, all the classified material, loaded on an airplane and took it to Moscow where it was interpreted. So it really set our intelligence back about 10 years. What about the crew? Well, one died of wounds. They were tortured for about 11 months, returned to U.S. custody on December the 23rd, and we'll get to the others. The whole crew was held together by Commander Bucher, and they were tortured, kept in isolation, and waterboarded, and that's not much fun. I've been waterboarded twice, so I know it's what happens to it. But he said, let's keep resisting, do whatever we can. Write letters to your families. The North Koreans were demanding they do that. And use bogus information. Tell them tell Aunt Betsy that I'm sorry that I stepped on Uncle Sam's toes. But those were all bogus, and the families knew they were bogus. And they worked out a system here too, because they were taking a lot of pictures of them and sending them back to the U.S. For propaganda purposes. Look how healthy these guys are. We're treating them well, and so forth. So they worked out a system here where the middle finger on every picture that was taken was in position. And the North Koreans says, what do you guys do? You always got your hands up like that. And say, oh, it's a Hawaiian good luck sign. And the Korean says, oh, well, those Hawaiians are kind of crazy anyway, so they let it go. So they still managed, every person sitting here has got that middle finger showing, and it became known as the middle finger photos. So why was that significant now? Time magazine in November 1968 published some of these propaganda photos and completely exposed what that middle finger was and why it was there and how it fooled the North Koreans and made them a bunch of dummies. That infuriated the North Koreans, and they went into what they call Hell Week. They tortured them and beat them unbelievably bad, including mostly Commander Bucher. They just really tore into him something fierce because they figured he was behind the whole thing, which he was. So when they did release the crew, they came back across the bridge of no return. There's North Korea, there's South Korea, and one at a time they were allowed to come across the bridge. You can see one back here and one in the middle of the bridge. Here's a reception group to take them in the buses back to Seoul. What about Commander Bucher? The Navy immediately opened a board of inquiry and decided they needed to court-martial Commander Bucher because he had not diligently exposed or protected his ship and his crew and his mission. And they were intent on court-martialing him. And that sounds like the Navy. We just went through a Navy SEAL routine about the same thing. Well, Commander Bucher got back to the U.S. and they decided after so much publicity, maybe we better call this off. So they did indeed call off the court-martial, and he continued his Navy career and retired from the Navy and died in 2004. And a lot of the reasons for the death was from the beatings that he took in captivity. So we just talked about that. So where is the Pueblo today? Well, it's in Pyongyang, capital of North Korea. How did it get there? Here's where the ship was captured and taken. So how did it get over here? I know damn well they didn't carry it across those mountains and that terrain. I've flown over that hundreds of times, and nothing but a mule could make it over there. So what they did, they got out in the international waters and took the ship around the peninsula and back up and brought it into Pyongyang on the Taedong River. And thanks to Google, there is the ship. This is Taedong River. This is Pyongyang. And in the forward part of the ship, they've got a gangplank, and on the aft deck, they've got another gangplank. And what is that for? It's a museum now. And if you go to North Korea today, you can go visit that ship, and they'll give you a tour, and they'll expect a little gratuity at the end of it. So that's pretty much the story, and the ship still sits right there. It's still carried in the Navy books as an active ship, and we don't know what's going to happen. The North Koreans have offered to give it back, but they want such a healthy penalty for taking it back that the State Department won't have anything to do with it. So these, what would you have done about that? And I've been through this scenario many times. You couldn't do this. They wouldn't stand a chance. The ship was already stripped. And why go up and bomb something that's already just a hulk sitting in the water? And we've already mentioned you couldn't do that. So why don't we just forget the whole thing? So that's the story of the Pueblo and how it happened. There's some predestination, some fate, lots of luck involved. But you can see there that nobody did anything terribly wrong, except in my mind that Navy admiral in Hawaii. Any questions? We'll just quit right there and.
Thank you. We'll take questions, and if I could, if you'll ask your question and allow me to repeat it for the rest of the audience. Yes, sir.
Why didn't we, after the affair was over, most powerful nation on earth, why didn't we retaliate in some fashion to make us all feel better?
The prevailing opinion in the U.S. State Department and the White House was that we still don't have a peace treaty with the North Koreans. It's still just a truce. That's all we've got. And they are constantly making threats about invading the South. They have 137,000 artillery pieces in caves and caverns north of Seoul, and I guarantee you in about 30 minutes they could completely wipe Seoul off the map, and we couldn't do anything about it. So the attitude has been, let's just don't get them excited and let them go ahead and do their thing. And the loss of Pueblo, and we got the crew back, so let's just forget it.
Yes, sir.
Why were the documents and the equipment on board not destroyed before the ship was taken?
The only way they could destroy it was to manually, as far as the paperwork was concerned, was either burn it or put it in bags and throw it overboard and hope it sank. But there was the volume of the equipment, the hardware and the paper was just overwhelming. They would have had to start it hours and hours and hours before they did, and that was probably their fault. But nobody ever told the Pueblo that anything was going on in North Korea. Nobody ever told them that the Blue House had been attacked and that everybody was on high alert. So that was part of the failings of the intelligence community.
Yes, sir.
How were the F-4s being launched? They were built at the time that it didn't take that long to
It takes longer than you think because the wiring that has to be accomplished and the safety measures for a nuclear weapon and a regular explosive weapon are totally different. The F-4 is not a good air-to-ground machine anyway because it was built as a fighter interceptor. It had no gun, and the missiles it carried had, would not have been effective against a ground target.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen improvement in communication between the Navy, the Air Force, Army? Are we doing a better job based on something like this?
Yes, I think we are. Yeah, we seem to be doing. Everybody has liaison officers now on both sides, and so if something happens in the Navy, and they've got an Air Force guy there, and say, "What in the world happened here?" That they can relate to their people. I think the biggest problem still is between the State Department and the whole intelligence community, the CIA. In fact, the CIA was behind the development of the SR-71, the spy ship, the black camera ship, the one that could go 3,000 miles an hour. And they flew over the harbor on January 28th and photographed the ship in the harbor. But those photos were never released to anybody.
I assume you were sent out to Maxwell, you were part of, I'm probably going to say the wrong project, Chaco. And I assume you were part of that and you were documenting what had happened.
There were just three of us that did that. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force asked Pacific Air Force historians to go out there and investigate what happened. So if anybody starts pointing fingers, we'll know if we had a hand in the whole thing. So three of us was sent over there to do just that. And I was even able to get down and read the notes out of the waste baskets in the battle staff when they met and what they talked about and what their decision process was. But after we wrote the report, because it involved nuclear weapons, they classified the report way above top secret level, so I never got to read it. So all of this comes from the memory of writing that report.
Was the ship set up with equipment to scuttle it, and why didn't they?
It was not set up for that. They never thought there would be a problem. We had an agreement, a tacit agreement with the Russians. We won't bother your spy ships if you don't bother our spy ships. And I think just assumed that all the communist nations would abide by that. So nobody really thought there was a great threat to the intelligence gathering ship. I don't know, how long does it take to sink a ship?
Turn the crank out down below,
Yeah.
and it starts leaking,
Well, it's a freighter, so I'm not sure that I know they weren't set up to intentionally scuttle a ship. I'm sure of that. That's a Navy problem.
Yes, sir.
Do we have ships like that now? Do we have ships spying on getting electronic information, or we get it off the satellite?
Most of it comes satellites.
So if something like this happens now, the president, administration, what would they do? Did we do that last week?
So you're asking if we had an asset that was captured now,
Yeah.
what would our response be?
We had it captured with the U.S.
You got to be kidding. Not likely. No, we started back in the 50s, we were sending airplanes over Russia, and very few of them ever came back. And then that's what led to the development of the U-2 spy plane, and it did fine until finally a missile got up high enough to knock it down. Then we went to SR-71s, and then we went to satellites. By that time, satellites had gotten pretty sophisticated.
So we don't face that kind of problem now. Is that correct?
We can see everything that isn't covered up.
Yes, sir.
How long ago? It was maybe 2 years ago. We had the UAC situation, a plane in either North Korea or probably China. I can't remember. They were about to scuttle all of that when they were finally released the next day. I mean, it's a similar situation. It was just compressed in time. And to answer your question, they were ready. They were about to kill the. Now, I'm assuming we learned a lot from the Pueblo that would allow us to know what to do the next time it happened in this case again.
I would assume, Mike, I'm not sure I followed that question entirely.
We had an airplane that was going to take apart completely over there, and they didn't do it. Because, this business of us learning, well, maybe they could learn. I mean, MacArthur, he had the right idea, but he backed up, well, soon he backed up. And so that's created this whole environment in the paper. So, I don't know what you think. Where, we don't have a situation where, our enemies need to learn that we will pull the trigger too. Did they learn? Have they learned that? Do you feel, after all your experiences and so forth?
I don't think there's anything that we know that they don't already know. And if the Russian Air Force wants to know what's going on in our Air Force, they just go by Aviation Week. Because everything is handled there. And they used to do that, by the way, back in the 60s. They had a Russian officer from the embassy, from the Russian embassy, and his sole duty was when the Aviation Week or the Air Force magazine came out, he took a stack of them, got on an airplane, and went to Moscow.
Well, that happened on the plastic when we first got the nuclear submarines on Rickover. Plastic nuclear submarines came out. Those things were so accurate. Because I was on the George Washington. We had, question, we had equipment on it. But those plastic models are almost identical to what George Washington was, how it was actually made.
Yeah.
So you're correct.
Yes, sir.
This incident happened about the time of the Tet Offensive. I'm assuming that what was going on in North Korea had little or nothing to do with what was going on in Vietnam. Do we know anything about the kind of intelligence they were able to gather at that point? How important was it to the U.S.?
His question was that this all seemed to be going on about the same time as the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. And, yeah. And Was there any association between the two, and what sort of intelligence were we able to gather at that time?
I don't think there's any association between those two at all. I really don't. And you can't assume that the Russians kept the North Vietnamese and the North Koreans and everybody else fully informed either. They were just too secretive at the time.
Yes.
The gentleman that was the captain, or whatever the title was of the ship, the boat, you said that he did come back, he was not court-martialed, and he stayed in the Navy and died a few years ago. Physically, and I'm sure probably had problems. How was it for him emotionally, and did he feel like that the U.S. had let him down?
Unfortunately, we can't ask him that question, but I'm sure that if you talk to a lot of the crew members are still alive, and they still ask the same questions. Why didn't somebody come to help us? And they don't know this background. You won't see it written anywhere.
Now that it's declassified, is it possible that there'll be a more complete history written and published?
I doubt it. I doubt it very seriously. There's just not any interest in it, really.
Was the Pueblo's role solely passive, in your opinion?
Yes.
Well, in essence, the classified information they were seizing and capturing came from them to begin with. So they probably already knew what was in there because it was information that came from them. Isn't that true?
Right.
So you still think it was just passive. It's not an active involved.
That's correct.
Yes.
So I may not really understand, but I get why they like the F4s, they couldn't get armed like quick enough, and like why they didn't help them immediately. What happened in like 11 months that nobody didn't get them?
There's a lot of negotiations going on between the State Department and North Korea. And the reason that the people were finally released was that the North Koreans said, we'll release the crew members if the U.S. government will do the following three things. They will apologize for the actions of the Pueblo. They will admit that they invaded the Korean waters. In other words, same as invading the nation by going into out of the international waters. And they would promise never to do that again. And it finally got down to those three things at Panmunjom, where they were negotiating for the crew members, and this went on for 11 months. And the State Department said, okay, we will agree to that under one proviso, that we can deny that we ever said that before you publish what we said. And that's what happens. That's exactly what happened. The State Department says the North Koreans are going to come out with these three statements. It's all a lie. And the North, excuse me, the North Korean says, okay, we got it in writing. Who are you going to believe? And that just I think it took about 2 hours for them to get the crew together and get them into Panmunjom. The international water line at that time was supposed to be 12 miles. And they say that they were outside that limit. I can't say. That's, again, a Navy problem. I've never seen a Navy report about it.
That officer that used to designate the officer had the call. Was he recommended in the way?
I have no idea what happened to that Navy admiral. He was an admiral, and he just arbitrarily made a decision that it was no longer a high-risk mission, and so he reduced it to minimal. It's probably a bean counter that was saying, okay, if it's a minimum risk mission, we don't have to have airplanes on alert. We don't have to have people dedicated to watching for what's happening to the ship, tracking it, and so forth. And nobody, I never heard anything from the Navy that they did anything or investigated it. In fact, the Navy, the Chief of Staff of the Navy, when he wiped the court-martial off the books, or the threat to court-martial off the books, he said, these guys have suffered enough, and there's enough blame here to go around to everybody. And that was his rationale, and that's all he said. I can't see a lot of blame here. There was a lot of fault, you know, things that just happen. And if that, even if that Air Force guy who went to the John had not done that and had immediately recognized the gravity of the situation, they still couldn't have gotten to Wonsan before dark. We had no air-to-ground capability at night in those days at all. It was 1968, the middle of the Vietnam War. And I've flown missions into North Vietnam and dropped a lot of bombs on the basis of what I could see under a flare. And if it came within a city block, I'd be surprised. So we just had no night capability like we do now. It's daylight up there.
The attack in Tonkin Bay, did that happen before, after, the death of the lady and all that shit? What was it?
No, the attack on the Blue House?
Yeah.
No, that was days before, just a couple of days before, actually, but
Close.
it was close, but they never made a connection with the Pueblo.
Yes, ma'am.
This boat was, at those times, that would be highly technical. And so I was wondering, if you send a boat out like that or a ship out like that, but there is no plan as to, I know it was international waters, but I mean, nevertheless, depending on where it was, that nobody had made a plan on what it was, you know.
The question was, that was a technical ship, and was there not a plan for dealing with an attempted boarding? And I'm sure there were procedures in place, but they were too cumbersome to be useful this quick. But her question is, why didn't they initiate whatever sequence of events should go with destroying equipment along with the documents as soon as they knew they were under attack?
Well, that's a judgment call on the part of the captain more than anything else, because he didn't think they were going to, he didn't see a threat initially at all, because the ships just circled him and didn't do anything about it. And if he had, on the 22nd of January, in fact, they were supposed to leave station on the 24th and go home. But if he had decided on the 22nd that those patrol boats were a threat, he had the option of calling the mission off and sailing for home. He could have left. But he didn't see a threat. He was international waters. And up to that point, everybody had complied with the international law on that. You don't touch a ship in international waters. And another, just a quick, one of the sister ships of the AGR-2 was in the Mediterranean doing exactly the same thing that they were doing off North Korea. They were doing this along the coast of Syria and that group. And the Israeli Air Force attacked that ship with aircraft and made repeated strafing runs, so it killed 32 of the crew members. I don't think the captain's wounded. And the Israeli Air Force didn't decide, well, maybe we've gotten the message to this ship that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing in our, or close to our shores. The Navy gave that captain the Medal of Honor for the way he handled his ship and saved his mission and his crew. Hell, he lost 32 people. And the Pueblo lost one. So who can say?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
If you remember that where we failed is that the Japanese feel the Koreans worse than anybody because they're ruthless. They had no conscience. And that's why the Japanese have not rearmed themselves. America's over there and armed them to protect South Korea from North Korea. And that belligerency still goes on. My little brother started a company in Taiwan, a light on corporation. And he spent 5 years over there and hired a bunch of people who were involved. But once we kiss and make up, you know, we start intermarrying and all. And so when we never, really for me, because I was a scientist at CI, is that we don't get into the brain of the other person and try to figure them out. And the Koreans, the worst thing that they can do is lose face. If they lose faith to their family, to the nation, they have got to put the sword in themselves. And that's who you're dealing with, that mindset. We can't even approach that until we get into these guys that came back, your members that survived that.
Now you get into politics. I agree with you because I've dealt with the
politics, but yet for those men and yourself or who were there, to hell with the politics, you're facing the guy that's going to cut your throat. And if he thought he could get away with it, he would. But then they had enough sense to go back and re-get it. Keep all the evidence and send the guys home, they're just bodies. Let them write their memoirs, you will deny everything.
You've hit on a point that's pretty sensitive in the military, always has been. I've dealt with the Asians for years and years and years, and let's see, I've forgotten who'd say it, but east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. And you will never, ever come to understand the Asian mind. And it's just the way, that's why we keep running around the world making, negotiating with people and accepting their word, because they don't see it the same way we do.
Can I take one last question, and then we'll turn it in? Anybody got one more question? Yes, sir.
Time magazine ever have any problems?
Not that I know of. No, but this sort of thing goes on all the time.
So did Time Magazine not suffer any repercussions for publishing that? Interesting.
Nope.
All right, thank you so much.